It's time for our regular governance update here on VLGA Connect. Our most requested guest is back, Mr. Stephen Cooper. Good afternoon to you. Well, one person asked me
Thank you
where
for that
Stephen
introduction.
was. Good to see you. I know you've been spending some time reading legislation, one of your favourite tasks this week. But before I get to that, we must... Indeed. We must acknowledge and welcome Lisa Anelli from Yarra Valley Water, who's going to join us for the conversation today. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. And we've got a potential co-star in the background there, we might just point out. That's your child doing some schoolwork.
That's my 8-year-old boy, yes, Lewis, who I will quietly write a note to and tell him to maybe keep it down.
It's all fine. It's all out of colour. We just, thought we should set that context. Steve, the omnibus legislation has been passed by the Parliament, and the big thing for local government is that as of the end of next week, you can now legally conduct your council meetings online.
As at May 1, Chris, yes. So as part of that 300-page omnibus, there's a new Section 12 in the Local Government Act which will give that permission. So effective from May 1, yes.
So, Steve, were there any surprises in that piece of legislation? I think we fully expected them to put a time frame on it, which they have. But I think people were also wondering what other sort of restrictions might be placed on the ability to hold those meetings online.
I think the surprises, if there are to be any, Chris, will be in the guidelines that are still to come. The Act itself is just quite simple, really. It basically says it overrides any contrary provision, including in the Local Government Act or subordinate documents such as the local laws, and it captures councils, delegated committees of councils. It picks up any special committees that might still be alive. It makes the requirement for library boards of regional libraries, although they don't have to post to the internet. So there is just a general ability in this piece of legislation to conduct meetings virtually.
And it sunsets in 6 months, is that correct?
It does on November 1. So good luck to any council that's able to hold a meeting after the council elections on October 24, because I suspect they won't be in action then. So effectively, it's in place for the term of the current council, presuming that the elections are held as scheduled.
Yeah, I was going to make that point, notwithstanding any possible announcement from the Minister next week, which we've been told to expect, which could go, of course, either way. We're going to spend some more time next week on VLGA Connect talking about the chairing of meetings in a bid to provide some guidance and advice to mayors and chairs. Before we move on to some observations from Lisa, the ability to hold closed meetings and or the requirement to have meetings still accessible in some way to the public, what does the legislation say about that, Steve?
Chris, the important part there is that meetings of council and any joint meetings between councils will need to be live streamed. In terms of delegated committees or special committees, if they're still going, there will be the option for councils to post the record or the recording or the stream of the meeting at a later date.
Steve, I noticed the wording. What caught my eye was the live stream on the council's internet site. And I'm assuming that's deliberate to allow for perhaps those councils that might use Facebook or YouTube to stream their council meetings. It doesn't have to be the official council website. Am I understanding that correctly, do you think? Is that the intent?
I think so, Chris. I think with that, again, you would want to look at the other governance and transparency guidelines of the organisation. What's really important there would be no doubt, is that people can find the recording. They should be able to go to the various channels of the council and find the recording, whether it's via the council's internet site or via the Facebook site. I think there's a belt and braces approach for councils just to make sure that those recordings are very accessible.
Good point. All right, Lisa, thank you for patiently sitting through that very governance-related legislation geeky discussion there that we do enjoy having. You might enjoy that too, for all I know. But you at Yarra Valley Water have been in the environment of conducting your board meetings in a virtual sense for quite some time. We thought it would be interesting to hear you talk about some of the learnings that you've picked up along the way.
Yeah, so we've been conducting video conference board meetings for the last, we've probably had about 4 or 5 now since COVID. And I guess some of the protocols that we put around it as we sort of learnt, probably from the very first meeting actually, it's quite quickly how you realise how these meetings should go after the very first one. I think what was important for us is we have 9 board members, including our executive director, the managing director. And what was important was in a video conference setting that you could actually see everybody. So from a chairing perspective, it meant that our chair was able to read the room. I think I made the point to Steve when we had a phone conversation about this, is that what is actually even better than a boardroom meeting is that the chair can actually see a grid of individuals where she can read body language when someone looks like they want to say something, whereas in a boardroom setting, she might be sitting in one particular spot and not, her peripheries there, but she's basically sort of looking around the room for it, but you can actually see it all there. So that was really important, to be able to have the functionality that you could actually see everyone at the one time. So that would be the first thing that I would say. Using features like a raise your hand feature is a neat little feature for the chair to be able to actually see that a participant would like to say something, so they raise their hand. So as I said, that's a good feature to use. We also allow participants to join the meeting 15-20 minutes earlier. So particularly in this social distancing environment that we're in at the moment, what was nice about that is that you could get on there 15 minutes earlier. We have our board meetings at 9 o'clock in the morning. So grab your cup of tea or coffee and connect with one another as you would when it's not a virtual meeting.
That's a good idea too, because generally that's going to happen anyway, you'd probably agree. So you don't want it to disrupt the flow of your meeting or delay getting down to business.
Yeah, that's right. So it is, particularly when you're a group of individuals that know each other, I think it's just nice to sort of break the ice, and if there's any technical glitches, you can get them sorted as well. I mean, it has an added value to that. But just to connect and have that ability to sort of just socialise prior to the meeting starting and getting underway with the official business. So I think that's definitely something that we'd recommend.
Lisa, you mentioned the use of the chat and the raise hand functionality, which are great tools, but is there a downside to that, have you found?
I think there's a downside.
They might be distracting, perhaps?
Yep, so definitely as a company secretary, I don't like to look at the chat because I do find it distracting. And ordinarily, if you weren't having a virtual meeting, the chat is the equivalent of 2 people on the side having a private conversation or someone talking to themselves in a conversation. And so I don't think that raise your hand function, but not the chat. I mean, chat, if it's a great work or it's complimenting or a thumbs up emoji or something like that, but to sort of go into any sort of extensive dialogue on a chat, I don't think it's appropriate in a board setting, and it is distracting. And as I said, in a physical meeting, it just wouldn't happen.
And if it did, that's the sort of thing the chair would probably pull up pretty quickly anyway.
That's right. That's exactly right. So and I do find it distracting from a governance COSEC perspective. I do find it distracting, and I don't generally have it open. And if someone does need to say something to me, that's for me in the meeting. So if the chair has something to say or the managing director has something to say to me specifically, they can just text me on my phone. Because I won't look at it on the chat. So keep the meetings no longer than 2 hours is really important, and to have breaks in that 2 hours. it's not an easy thing to sit at a screen for 2 hours in an intense dialogue for anything more than 2 hours. I mean, if you can keep it under, I think that's ideal.
I think that's going to be an interesting one, Lisa, if I may just bring Steve back into the conversation. I think that's going to be an interesting one for councils, particularly, you know, we've all sat in briefing sessions that have gone 4, 5, 6 hours, particularly around budget time of the year. I think that's a real consideration for councils, how they manage, you know, active and, you know, useful contributions if their meetings are going too long in a more tiring environment like the virtual world.
Chris, I have to agree with that. And it really makes it so important for councils to consider the delegations that are in place at the moment and to work closely with the executive about what is the business that will come before the council and the necessity. And I think particularly given that the community attention has shifted in the last couple of months.
Lisa, have you found the chair of your meetings finds the virtual meeting world more tiring than in the real world? Is that something that's been commonly, I'm hearing that from a few other people. It's the concentration factor.
Can I just go back? I'll answer that question in a moment. I just want to add to your comment previously. One of the things that I think is a real opportunity for us in terms of the way we work is that even though you shorten meetings, I think what it forces is for management to get smarter about what they're submitting. And we're finding that just because you're having shorter meetings, it shouldn't necessarily dilute or take away what the purpose of those meetings are and being able to reach decisions. We just need to get smarter and a bit more innovative around how we present that information so that we keep it shorter. We really are honing in on the key messages and having it informed enough for groups to make a decision. So for me, it actually does flip a bit of governance on its head in some ways. I think, you know, we as at Yarra have always been striving to shorten our board papers. And that's a real, that's a challenge for a lot of management within an organisation because they typically write for GMs or the managing director, and there's a lot of information in there. But when it gets to a board, you just don't need that degree of information. You need to be able to tell a story that gets you the same outcome, which is to make a decision. So I think it does present an opportunity in terms of getting a bit smarter as to how you present information.
It's a whole separate topic that I reckon we could spend some time on. Report writing, really, for informed decision making. Just that issue of the tiredness. Do you think is that real?
I don't see that from our chair. I think that she's very effective in chairing the meetings in this new virtual world. And as I said, the board members, we typically have an open review of meeting at the end of each meeting. And we're getting feedback that the quality of discussion is just as good as if it was a physical face-to-face meeting. I don't think that she's tiring at all.
That could be part of limiting to two hours as well. I'm sorry, Steve.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Lisa, what were the steps that the chair and the board went through to sort of agree the informal protocols or guidelines that they would operate under in this virtual world?
Yeah, so it was a question of having that first meeting. None of us knew how that was going to go. And then we had an open review of the meeting afterwards. And that was really how we got some feedback on what we needed to do differently. And that's where we set the protocols up in terms of shorter meetings, short, succinct papers that still provide enough information to be able to meet the objectives and the purpose. So that was pretty much how we arrived at the protocols, and everyone agreed to those once we sort of documented them, not formally, but which is probably something we need to do, but it was through email that we actually did that and said these are the things that we're going to be doing for the next meeting. And then you look to refine that as you continue on through the open review. I was going to say another great feature is that the waiting room for video conferencing is great. So that's the same as someone waiting outside our boardroom, and we open the door and they come in. So that's a good feature as well, because you don't have someone in the meeting ahead of time, before their items being discussed. So that's another good feature as well.
Steve, a final thought or a question from you?
No, just picking up on Lisa's last comment, Chris, there's some really other important elements of that legislation around proper management of confidential information and also conflicts of interest. So, for example, a waiting room might be really useful where a councillor does declare a conflict of interest and you can find a way of excluding them from the meeting. That won't be mandated in terms of the method that the council takes, but there'll certainly need to be some quality assurance around it to make sure that the intent of the Act is met. So it's a really important point.
And one of the complicating factors, I guess, is that you won't expect all councils to be using the same technology. And so therefore some of the functionality may differ, or the way in which it's used. So I think that's an element that we're going to have to work out over the next few weeks. Going to have to draw a line there. As I said, we will talk more particularly about effective chairing of meetings on a special forum next week that we have confirmed. Stephen, you'll be with us, Ruth McGowan will be with us, and the Mayor of Monash, Councillor Stuart James, has agreed to be with us as well, and we'll be inviting broader public participation in that session. So I think that's been a good taster today. Lisa, really appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for joining us, and all the very best to you. Stephen, that's it for another governance update. I imagine soon we need to talk about electoral structures, as the information was released this week on which structures would be taken to the next election, whether that's in October or beyond. So we'll come back to that one, I gather, in the next week or two.
Look forward to it, Chris.
That's our regular governance update for this week. Stay tuned for more VLGA Connect coming to your device very soon. And if you'd like to have some input into future episodes, you might have a story idea, for example, or would like us to talk about what's happening in your patch, drop us an email, vlga@vlga.org.au. We'd love to hear from you. See you soon on VLGA Connect.